Good afternoon. Welcome to Live at the Museum for the first of our time change 12:30 slots. My name is Penny and I work in the Lifelong Learning team here at the National Museum. I'm joined today by our resident rock star, Dr. Stephen Munro from the curatorial team. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Penny. How are you going?
We're going to talk about some of the earliest forms of life today, but before we get into today's program, as always, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. We're filming today on the lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples of Canberra. I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and I would like to extend that respect to any and all First Nations people here present. Also, before we head on, I would like to give a special shout out to Camp Hill State School in Brisbane. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, guys. I hope you enjoy the program. All right. So, Stephen, do you mind introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about what you do and how you fit into the museum?
Yeah, sure, Penny. Well, hi, I'm a curator here at the National Museum, and a really generous introduction there, but the term rock star, I think, that needs to go to our special guest today, Malcolm Walter, who we'll see a little later. He's a real expert in geology. I've got a bit of a background in natural history and biology, and also the evolution of humans. But what I'm really hoping to do today and looking forward to is talking about some of the objects that we'll be displaying in a new gallery that we're developing on the environmental history of Australia.
Thank you very much. You mentioned Dr. Malcolm Walters, who was instrumental in the acquisition of one of the museum's stromatolites, and we actually have a little piece from Malcolm about the stromatolite that's been cut for life in Australia. So we're going to throw into that. If you have any questions, please pop them in the live stream as soon as they come into your head, and we will get to them in just a moment. Thank you.
What we have here is a fragment of a reef that's 2.7 billion years old that formed in a lake in the Pilbara in Western Australia. And it tells a story about early life on Earth. This dates from a time on Earth when there were no animals and no plants, only microbes on Earth. And each of these layers that we can see here formed by a layer of microbes on the floor of a lake. And the layers form as sand is washed onto the layers, and they grow up and make another layer, and eventually they build a giant reef, of which is just a small part. As best we can tell, the sorts of microbes that form this thing are called cyanobacteria, and they were photosynthetic, so they used the energy of sunlight to build their cells and grow. And they had a process that was particularly important in changing the environment on Earth, and that is they have what's called oxygenic photosynthesis, so that in carrying out their lifestyle, they actually released oxygen from water. And that's how the oxygen got in the atmosphere, first of all. Before this time, 2.7 billion years ago, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, or maybe just a tiny trace. But when these microbes, the cyanobacteria, released oxygen into the atmosphere, what happened was that the iron that was previously dissolved in the oceans precipitated out and formed the giant, what geologists call banded iron formations in the Hamersley Ranges, not far from where this stromatolite comes from. And that's the source of all the iron ore that we're now exporting all over the world. So the cyanobacteria fundamentally changed the chemistry of the surface of the Earth. Stromatolites like this still exist today, but they're rare. And they're rare because the microbes that form them are part of the food chain. They get eaten by animals, for example. We know there are animals almost everywhere these days. And as a result of that, stromatolites are very rare. But they do occur in some places like Shark Bay in Western Australia, where the salinity is very high in the marine water there because of the arid environment and the evaporation of the seawater. And that high salinity keeps out most of the animals, and so stromatolites are able to form in places like that. If we look closely at this rock, we can see the detailed layers that were built by the microbes. Down the bottom here, for instance, we can see these structures bending around like that. And that's because we've got a cross-section here through something that was the shape of a hamburger bun. And so you can imagine a great big bun-shaped structure with all these layers within it. Each layer represents something like a storm or maybe a season. So we have a record here that would be over hundreds of years, probably, in forming. And something happened at about this level here. Instead of the continuous layers that we have in the lower part of the specimen, we have finger-like columns which are internally layered. And they have sediment between the fingers. So maybe it was a time when there were lots of storms and lots of sediment being dumped onto the microbial mats, as we call them, and so these finger-like structures formed. So this whole process would have probably taken maybe 1,000 years to go from the bottom to the top of this particular specimen. If we look in this position, we can see pebbles of limestone that were washed up to the lower part of this stromatolite bun. So you have to imagine a dome here, cross-section through a bun, and another one right over here. And here's the hollow between those two stromatolite reefs. And here are the pebbles that were washed into that hollow, probably during a violent storm. Overall, this is like modern reefs in terms of the overall shape of the domes and so on. There are corals that look like this, but of course there were no corals and no animals at this time. So this is a reef built entirely by microbes. But it could have been as large as the Great Barrier Reef. In fact, there are examples in the rock record that are as large as the Great Barrier Reef, built entirely by microbes. We think that at the time that this particular reef formed, Australia, or this part of Australia anyway, was part of a supercontinent and connected to India probably and to South Africa. And there are similar structures that occur in those places now. But there would have been rivers that had their origins, say in South Africa, flowing into this lake which is now in the Pilbara. And you can actually see the sandy sediments from those rivers now if you go to the right places in the Pilbara.
Stephen, is the stromatolite in that footage on display at the museum currently?
It's not currently on display. In fact, that stromatolite was brought into the museum by Malcolm about 20 years ago for one of the first exhibitions which was held at the museum, Mars and Beyond, looking for the origin of life. The whole rock, that stromatolite, that section that you just saw, was on display in that particular exhibition. But for the Life in Australia gallery, and I should give you a bit of background on what we're trying to do in Life in Australia, what we're really interested in this new environmental history gallery, which will be a permanent gallery opening next year at the museum, is we're really looking to see those intersections between human society and the environment. Humans are, of course, part of the environment. We're embedded within the natural systems of the world. What we're really interested in doing is exploring how different species, different plants, weather systems and so forth interact with humans and influence the way we live our lives. But also looking right back in the deep past and seeing how parts of the deep history of the Earth influence humans today. Humans obviously only been on the Earth, on the planet Earth, only for a few million years, whereas the types of rocks that we're looking at today have been around for billions of years. But as Malcolm mentioned in that recording that you saw there, those stromatolites early on really did influence life on Earth, producing the oxygen. The microbes that produce these stromatolites produced oxygen that helps us live today. The rock itself, as I mentioned, is about 4.5 tons. So that's too big for us to display. And what we wanted to do is be able to really reveal the sedimentary layers in that were built up by the microbes. So what we did is we took that rock down to Sydney to a place where they cut rocks of sandstone, basically to restore the heritage buildings in Sydney. So they've got the equipment there to be able to cut a rock of this size. So we really wanted to get a section of the rock that we could then polish. We could display it on what we call a mineral wall, and that would reveal the layers. And so we actually invited Malcolm to Sydney to be able to supervise the cutting of the rock, and he chose an area of the rock to cut so that could reveal the stromatolite in all its glory, basically. The rock itself, like I mentioned, is about 4.5 ton. It comes from the Pilbara. It contains a number of different stromatolites, so we had to make sure that we cut it in such a way that we did reveal those layers. And you saw in those pictures how how those layers really are informative and quite detailed. So we're looking forward to next year when we open the gallery, having that as part of a mineral wall that looks at the geological history of Australia, and in particular how that influences and affects human society today.
Can I ask, the stromatolite, is that the life form or is that the structure that the life form builds?
Well, that's a really good question. In fact, when we talk about stromatolites, what we're talking about is the structure that's been built. Now, of course, as Malcolm mentioned there, we do have stromatolites that are alive today, that are living in places like Shark Bay. But what we have in the past is basically a fossil record of past stromatolites that have grown right in the deep past. So occasionally we will find the microbes themselves. There'll be evidence of those microbes, but usually what we're actually finding is just the structures that they built. So the method that they use to build themselves, so they're basically trapping and binding bits of sediment together. So in fact, that's the interesting thing about the stromatolites, is that they're what they are is the result of both biological processes and environmental processes, because we're having sediments washed onto the mounds, and then the biological process of binding, cementing, and actually bringing these things together. Just getting my gloves on here because this is an object that's in the National Historical Collection, so I can't pick it up with my hands. But you can see the detailed layers here. And so basically what we're seeing, as Malcolm talked about before with the stromatolite that he was talking about, which is 2.7 billion years old, this one here is about 3.4 billion, so considerably older. And what we have is layers that have built up. So you can imagine this one is part of a sequence of stromatolites that grew in a shallow sea, so on the beach, right from the beach, the rocky shore, right out into the deeper marine parts of that particular ocean. We have these stromatolite reefs, and there's different types of them. This one has what they call an egg carton almost shape on the top, and this would have been the surface of the sea floor billions of years ago, 3.4 billion years. And when we think about how old the Earth is, the Earth's about 4.5 billion years old. Here we have something that was one of the evidence of some of the earliest, very earliest life forms that we have. So we can see in these layers that it's built up slowly over time, one layer at a time, colonies of microbes. So these are various different types of microbes that are living together, and they are trapping the sediments that are being washed onto them, binding them together, and through the growth of those microbes themselves, they're cementing them together so that this grows up, eventually becomes a rock. And so this is the structure, is a stromatolite, but it's not. It becomes a rock because it's basically using sediments that have been washed into this particular area. Now this particular rock itself is really special in that this has been to outer space. It's one of the earliest, it's some of the earliest evidence we have for life on Earth, but it's also, as I said, been into space. And the reason for that was because Andy Thomas, who was Australia's first astronaut, he was looking for something really special to take up into space. Previously, he had taken a piece of Mawson's hut, so down in Antarctica, and also a slither of the propeller of the Southern Cross, which is from Kingston Smith's famous aircraft. So these pioneering feats from long ago in Australian history were taken into space. Malcolm Walter suggested that this would be a really particularly magical thing to take into space, and so he was able to do that. Now the reason why he had access to this is because his student, Abigail Allwood, was studying these, and she actually collected this fossil. She did a lot of study in the Pilbara, and she's an astrobiologist, which means that she's actually interested in the origins of life, not only on Earth, but in places like Mars. And she's now working for NASA, so that on the next time that they send probes and so forth to Mars, they can look for ancient life on Mars by looking at the examples of the types of ancient life we have on Earth. And so when we look at the earliest types of life forms and the signatures that they leave, which are these formations, then we can start perhaps when we go to other planets like Mars and we are working out whether or not life did live there, then we know the types of things to look for.
Not quite the bug-eyed aliens we were expecting. Ivy from Camp Hill State School, hi Ivy, would like to know how many different types of stromatolites are there?
Well, that's a really great question as well, and there are a number of different types. In fact, what we have is we have both stromatolites, but there are different types of microbial mats, they're called, and in fact the term microbialite is a term used for structures that are basically made by biological processes. So these are microbes that build up layer upon layer, but they're not always layer by layer. Stromatolites are laminated, so they have layers, but there's other thrombolites, for example, which are less layered, and they have complex species of colonies of microbes that make them. But yeah, there are a number of different types of stromatolites, at least 5 or 6 that I'm aware of, which this is one, and the one that we saw Malcolm talking to before was a slightly different one as well. So again, it depends on the colony of microbes that are forming them, but also the environmental conditions that they're living in. So the depth of the water, the type of substrate that they're on, where they're built will determine what type of stromatolite we end up with.
Oliver would like to know, what do they feel like?
Okay, well, once they're fossilized, they're actually, this is a solid rock, so it's not a lot different to the type of rock that you might pick up anywhere. But when a stromatolite is alive, you'll find that it's got kind of a slimy type of feel, because that's the type of the colony that the microbes themselves are making. So it'll be quite slippery, a little bit spongy on the top, but as it fossilizes, it's actually using sediments that are around it. So it becomes lithified and turns into a rock eventually.
We have a question from one of our regular viewers, David. What was the marine environment like for this formation? Was it tidal or a shallow sea?
Yeah, so this was near shore, and there certainly was tidal situations occurring. However, what we know is that it was a sort of a rocky coast, and as far as we know, the formations, the reefs themselves, extended from the coast down into to the marine environment itself. And so, as I said, there's different parts of that particular ecosystem were producing different types, but there's a number of different types of stromatolite just from this formation. But like I said, there's 80 million years worth of sedimentation and growth of stromatolites in this particular formation. And so over that period there was changes, but a lot of different stromatolites in reef type formations were formed over that period.
Alberto Gomez would like to know, are cyanobacteria blue?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question too. And as far as we know, yeah, well, cyanobacteria, they do have within them properties that have both a blue and a green type that give off those colours, and that the name of them themselves, cyanobacteria, sort of refers to that blueness that they do have in them. And in fact, we know sometimes cyanobacteria are known as blue-green algae. They used to be commonly known as that, but in fact we know that they're not algae today. They are actually bacteria, but certainly those colours that you get are from those microbes themselves.
How old are the stromatolites compared to dinosaurs? That one's from Carolyn.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question too. And so the stromatolites, of course, there are stromatolites that live today, but these stromatolites we have in our collection, so this one's 3.4 billion years old. So you've got to think of, if we look at the history of the Earth, if we condense it down into, say, for example, a day, then life on Earth appears sort of early in the morning, about 4 o'clock or so. And we have stromatolites probably in that early period, 5, 6 o'clock or something in the morning. But for the rest of the day, we won't see much at all in terms of other life forms. It's microbes, pretty much for 80% of the history of life on Earth. We've got these microbes, very microscopic organisms, and it's not until later on in the evening, if we were looking at the history of the whole Earth in one day, later on in the evening, about 8:30, we start to see more multicellular or more complex organisms. But dinosaurs themselves don't appear until about, it is 200 million years or so ago, 250 million years ago or so. So that's probably about an hour before midnight or so we start to see dinosaurs. So it really is a long time that these types of microbes that built these types of stromatolites are the only thing we see in terms of life on Earth. And the dinosaurs are, compared to these stromatolites that we have in our collection, are relatively recent, very recent at all. Humans, a lot more recent than that. I mean, when we look at humans, dinosaurs became extinct about 65 million years ago, and humans only really appeared, Homo sapiens, only a few 100,000 years ago. And our genus, Homo, will be about 5 million years ago or so.
Something like 2 or 3 minutes before midnight.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and when we look at it like that, it's a really short period of time that humans have been on the Earth.
Blink and you'll miss it.
That's it.
Liam would like to know, are stromatolites rare on Earth?
Yeah, well, that's a great question too. Thanks, Liam. I mean, the thing is that stromatolites today are rare. We don't see them, and one of the reasons for that, as Malcolm mentioned in his talk, is that they're outcompeted by a lot of other animals that have evolved since. So when microbes first appeared, there was no animals basically to eat them. So these microbes of microbes that form mats today, they will be grazed upon by animals such as snails and things that live in these environments. So they're not quite as common. The places where we find them are places where perhaps that competition and that grazing doesn't occur. So they're very rare today, but if we went back deep into the past, actually it's the most common life form that we would see evidence of. And in fact, certainly in the fossil record, stromatolites, if we go past earlier than 1 billion years, that really is the life form that dominates the fossil record. Whereas today they are more rare, so it's quite an interesting question, interesting to look at why they're rare today, whereas they were common in the past.
Outcompeted by things with backbones.
Yeah, and then of course we've got corals and other types of seaweeds and so forth that are better adapted now to living in those environments, and so they literally do outcompete these microbes that built the stromatolites.
Something to be said for simplicity, though. Are there lots of scientists researching stromatolites around the world? That's from Georgia.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm sure there are. I know that in Australia's got a particularly great record of producing scientists who look at stromatolites and study them. And so there are certainly within Australia lots of some of the really leading research that's been done on stromatolites comes from here in Australia, and that's because we've got good fossil records of stromatolites. And the reason for that is because we've got ancient landscapes. So the Pilbara is part of the Earth's crust, and it's been there for 3.5 billion years or so. Other parts of Western Australia and South Australia and the Yilgarn Craton, that's some of the earliest evidence of rocks we've got from anywhere on Earth, from those particular locations. There's other old parts of the Earth's surface exist in South Australia, and so that's why we've got a particularly good record here in Australia of studying microbialites, I guess they're called, and that term was first used by Australian scientists, and that basically refers to any rock or structure that's made from microbes, microbialite, of which stromatolites are one type.
So there's certainly a career in it, if that's what you're thinking. Are the microbacteria similar to the ones that make oil? That's a question from Kai.
Yeah, well, another great question. And the thing is, the cyanobacteria that we know form stromatolites today are very common forming stromatolites, and the ones that have formed them in the past, there's actually a range of different types of these. Now, in terms of what actually forms oil, that's a great question. I don't know the exact answer to that, but it's something that would be really interesting to look up. But there's the number of microbes and the different and the range of microbes is really astonishing. And even the exact types of microbes that built these stromatolites in the past, we can only really guess at, and we guess at that because we've got stromatolites that live today, and so we see they're living today, these are what made those. So it's likely that they made them in the past, but there are always speculation as to what type of microbes and the makeup of those colonies, because it's never just one particular species of microbe or type of microbe. It's a colony of different microbes that are all living together, interacting and building these. And I'd say it's the same with those types of processes.
Caitlin would like to know, do animals feed on them?
Well, exactly, they do. So blue-green algae is a food source for a lot of animals, and other types of microbes, plankton, for example, are fed on by giant whales, and so they certainly are a very important food source. And that's one of the reasons why we had the answer before about stromatolites being really common in the past, but not quite rare today. And it's because from the time that stromatolites first evolved, or the microbacteria that make stromatolites evolved billions of years ago. Since then, the atmosphere has changed, complex life has evolved, including animals, and so those animals will feed on the colonies of bacteria as they grow, which means that they're less common than they are today. So they certainly are a food source for a number of different animals.
Good science history question coming in from Mosquito Life. Can the formations provide data on the atmospheric composition at the time?
Well, look, that's a great question as well, and that's something we're exploring in the new gallery, is being able to, scientists looking at ancient cores, for example, of Antarctic ice cores, and seeing what the atmosphere was like in the past. And that's one of the ways that we know that the atmosphere has changed in the past, and when we look into the future, we can try to predict what sort of changes there will be. And that is by basically looking at the chemical composition of different elements within those ice cores to see what the atmosphere was like, the percentage of oxygen, for example, that was in there. And it's the same as what scientists do when they're looking at these rocks and so forth. They can determine how much oxygen, and so we know that there were events in the past where oxygen suddenly became much more common and prevalent within the atmosphere. And we believe, the scientists believe, that was because the cyanobacteria that were building stromatolites, such as we have in our collection, were producing oxygen, and this changed fundamentally the composition of, first of all, the Earth's oceans, which were full of iron at that stage, and that's why we have the banded iron formation, as Malcolm mentioned in his earlier recording. But then it went into the atmosphere, and that oxygen actually wasn't that good for a lot of the life forms that were there, because it was quite toxic to them. So it poisoned a lot of the life forms that were existing at that time. However, life as we know it has come to live and need oxygen. So it's helped life as we know it evolve.
Riley from Camp Hill would like to know, how do you age stromatolites?
Another great question, and so this really goes to geology and stratigraphy, and being able to do tests basically on various parts of the what we call the rock record. And so geologists really are making sure that when they're looking for, and often they're looking for things like fossil fuels or minerals or so forth, they really want to have a good understanding of the age of the sediments that they're looking at and the rocks. So they use different methods. I know that we can use uranium dating. We use carbon dating for more recent parts of the natural environment, but that only goes back, probably only useful for tens of thousands of years or so, whereas there are different chemical types of tests that we can do to try to determine the ages of older deposits. But generally it's looking at the stratigraphy and saying, okay, this was laid down first, and then this, so that we know through that stratigraphy that things that are laid down on top are generally younger than the things that are laid down the bottom. So that's one of the common ways that we try to date sediments and try to tell their age. And we know sometimes certain, if there's a volcanic eruption and we can date that, then we know that that volcanic eruption will have a signature over a long period. Underneath that, it must be older than that volcanic eruption. and anything on top of that is going to be younger. So looking at the stratigraphy and using different chemical processes to date things is one of the things scientists do, not only in geology but paleontology and so forth, to try to determine the age of different formations.
I love that when we start to talk about geologic records, we say things like only tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Sarah would like to know if stromatolites decompose.
Yeah, well, like any rock formation, these formations generally, they certainly are subject to erosion. And I would say that most, in the past we would have had stromatolites being built, and they would have been quite common. But even finding fossils of stromatolites today is quite rare, because the chances of them actually having been built and then surviving to the present day, when you think that they were made billions of years ago, is really quite unlikely when you consider the different things that can happen to the Earth's surface. So we have uplift, we have volcanic eruptions, and all these things can obliterate basically what's on the Earth's surface. So to find them is quite rare, but certainly erosion can occur, and like any rock, stromatolites can be eroded and can deteriorate and can decompose. But like I said before, we're not talking about often organic materials here, because they're microbes. Those microbes don't often fossilize. So we're talking about basically rocks, same sort of rocks that would make up sandstone or limestone. So these things certainly are subject to the same types of erosional processes that other rocks are exposed to.
I love this question. I think Finlay reads the same kind of books that I do. Could stromatolites be moved to different planets to determine if they would adapt to the new environment?
Well, that's a fantastic question too. I guess, yeah, well, I'd have to leave that one up to the astrophysicists and astrobiologists. But certainly, as I mentioned before, looking at stromatolites is certainly something that scientists are doing to try to determine whether there is life on other planets. And in particular, we're looking at Mars at the moment, and there's expeditions planned to Mars where they will try to look to see whether there are actually any evidence of life on that planet. But yeah, that's a really great question. It's something that I'd want to leave to the experts in that field to determine.
The astrobiologist, is that the
well, yeah,
Georgia? Yeah,
they'd be the people to determine that for sure.
So we're coming to the end of the program. We do have time for a couple more questions. If we don't get to your question, or if you're not watching live, please pop them in the live public comments below, and we will get to them. Just may not be live on camera. Leith is one of our last questions and would like to know, do microbes create other things?
Do microbes create other things? Well, I mean, the thing about microbes is that they are everywhere, and without microbes, we wouldn't be alive. We actually, we've got microbes within our own body, and so the interesting thing about microbes is that they can form relationships with other living things. And in fact, the origins of life on Earth, no doubt, is the combination of microbes coming together to form the types of cells that make up the bodies of humans, and then also of plants and other animals and so forth. So, microbe, if you want to think about it that way, the microbes that we have in our body allow us to live. Without them, we wouldn't be able to survive. We've got microbes in our digestive system, for example, that help break down our food. We can't do it without them. So you could say that microbes really are, the pivotal in building all of life on Earth. Without microbes, we certainly wouldn't be here, and the planet wouldn't be the same. And I can also imagine that long after we're gone, microbes will still be here.
The microbiome of the human body is a really interesting thing to sort of look up if you've got more interest in these kinds of questions. Walter would like to know, how do you sort stromatolites?
How do you sort? Yeah, so scientists, looking at stromatolites, experts on that, they'll look at the features of those stromatolites, and then they'll determine what type they are. So often it's to do with what we would call the morphology of the particular stromatolite, the shape of them, how they're layered, and so forth, and that will determine what category that they would sort those stromatolites into. So yeah, often it is to do with the particular morphology of the particular stromatolite. But as I said, they are complex organisms that build these colonies of microbes that are all working together to build these stromatolites into sometimes quite large structures and extensive in terms of the types of reefs that they built in the deep past.
Sorry for everybody who's still asking questions. This is our last question, but please do pop them in the comments below and we'll get to them later. Din would like to know, how much are stromatolites worth?
Well, that's a great question too. And I guess whenever we're talking about the value of something, I mean, how do you measure the value of something? The stromatolites we have in our collection, they're worth certainly a lot to us, because they're allowing us to tell some of the story of the ancient Earth and its history. So I imagine it's got to do with the rarity of stromatolites as to how much they're worth. I'm sure some are worth more than others. But what sort of value you put on something. I mean, this, for example, is a 3.4 billion year old stromatolite that's been into space. Not too many of those sorts of rocks around, or objects of that type. So you could say that this is probably priceless, I would say. And certainly to the museum here, we're going to look after this for generations to come. It's part of the National Historical Collection, and for us, it is priceless.
Thank you everybody for joining us today, and especially big thanks to Camp Hill for all your very excellent questions. If you have some more questions, gather them together and send them through to curator@nma.gov.au, and we will be able to pass those along to Stephen, and he hopefully will have some time to get to those questions and fill them in. Please join us next week for a conversation with Craig and Libby, who are our Defining Moments curators, as we talk about rapid response and contemporary collecting. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.